We now discuss computer generations. So this may be a bit technical, more than the one we have just discussed. Computer generations actually discusses how computers have developed in the very early days or until now, until where we are now. So initially, the generation term was used to distinguish between varying hardware technologies. Nowadays, generations include hardware and software, which together make the entire computer system. So there are 5 computer generations that we have until up to date. So we are going to be starting by discussing the earliest one. They are normally characterized by time, and therefore we have a table here that gives us the time when each of the generations were developed. So the first generation was developed between or around 1946 to 1959. And the major characteristic with these computers, and I think might have mentioned that in our earlier section of the unit, is that we were using vacuum tubes for processing of information, and later on we developed to start using transistors. So transistors made the computers much faster and much smaller. These ones, the computers that were in this range, were actually the size of a building. The computers you see today, in the early days of 1940s and 50s, they used to could occupy an entire building, and they used to be called mainframe computers. But they're going to be seeing those terms later. So as the technology developed, we were able now to replace the vacuum tubes with what is now known as transistors. And again, transistors were still a bit huge, but at least they allowed us to have higher speeds and smaller sizes. But then in that generation between 1965 and 1971, we developed to now what is known as ICs, or rather integrated circuits. So in the ICs, as we have discussed in our previous section, they allow multiple transistors, multiple electronic components to be in one chip, and therefore one chip made the computers much smaller again and much faster. So in the 4th generation, which is now in the age of the rise of Bill Gates, and I know you might know this term, and the rise of Steve Jobs. If you don't know about these two gentlemen, who are the people who have made the computers of today, you can always Google. But they started making computers in the late 1980s. So that is where they started. And the concept there is that we had what is called very large scale integration. It's a form of ICs that allowed them to have thousands of electronic components installed in a single chip, and a chip could be a size of an inch or even less. 1 inch, 2 inches, it can store 1,000 or more electronic components. Then in the 5th generation of computers, that is where we are, 1980 onwards, that is where we now talk about ULSI, the large scale integration. So that is where we are. Since for the last 30 years, the computers have been technically using the same technology, except in advancement of speed, advancement of the storage capacity, among others. So technically, that is how computers have developed, and now we are going to be discussing each of these generations in more details. So we say that the first generation of computers was born in 1946 to 1959. The computers of first generation used vacuum tubes as the basic components for memory and circuitry for CPU. CPU we are going to be running later is also called Central Processing Unit. These tubes, like electric bulbs, produced a lot of heat, and the installations used to fuse quite frequently. And therefore, they were very expensive, and only large organizations could be able to afford those computers. Now, in this generation, mainly batch processing operating systems was used. So another concept that you might learn is that you would feed a lot of information. Information that the input was in form of punched cards. These are terms we are going to get used to over time, but we are going to be defining each of these. Magnetic tapes, and if you want to have a picture of what a magnetic tape look like, I'm not sure how old you are, but in the old days, we used to have cassettes, and cassettes used to have a small hole there and a small hole there, and at the top here we used to have not a thread but rather a magnetic tape that used to run inside this. So this used to be a tape, and information used to be stored here. I don't know if you ever found them or not, but these are what which used to be called magnetic tapes, and therefore they are very useful in storing of information. And therefore, because they were very slow and they were bulky, we used to have what was called then batch processing system. And we will see more details of this at a later stage. But punched cards, we will see them, but we are saying that you would feed a lot of information in this computer, and once you have fed it, then you tell it to process all the information that you have fed it. So you give it something, then you now give it some more information. This is what used to be called batch processing. So we have just said that that was what characterized the first generation of computers. This is how they used to look like. So if you have ever heard of first generation computers, they used to produce a lot of heat. As I mentioned, they were like a whole building, and the inputs were like it's a whole lab, probably what is now used in to launch robots or to launch missiles. So the main features of the first generations are that they use the vacuum tube technology. They were a bit unreliable because of the heating and the switching off, etc. They supported machine language only. So we talk about machine language. There are some languages that we learn. We used to call them high level language and low level language. High level is what we use now. Computers now use high level. In the old days, we used to have low level, and one of the low level language is machine language. So we will see them at a later stage. And the other thing is that they were very costly, that they could not be owned. Right now, every one of you owns a computer. But in those days, only only government or very, very well-funded institutions could afford them. They used to generate a lot of heat. They were very slow in the input and output. They were huge in size. They were not portable, and they consumed a lot of power. So some of those computers, you can even always Google them. Some of those computers are what are known as ENIAC, EDVAC, IBM 701, among others. So you can always Google for these computers, and you actually read more about them. And therefore, you will actually see where we were some 70 years ago and where we are now. Now, let's talk about second generation computers. And the period of second generation was from 1959 to 1965. In this generation, transistors were used that were cheaper, they consumed less power, they were more compact in size, they were more reliable and faster than the first generation computers, because the first generation computers used vacuum tubes. Again, in the second generation, magnetic cores were used as primary memory. So the other major change that occurred in the second generation is that memory changed from punched cards, and we were now using magnetic cores, and magnetic tapes also became more prevalent, and magnetic disks were used for secondary storage. So what we will also learn is that we have two types of storage: primary storage of computers and secondary storage. So we are seeing in the primary storage, we were using more of magnetic cores, and they were much faster than even magnetic tapes that we saw were used in the primary storage of the first generation computers. So in this generation, assembly language. So as I mentioned, we are going to be discussing about languages, and assembly language was used. And again, there was a development of high-level programming languages like Fortran, COBOL, among others. So these again use batch processing, and multi-programming operating systems came into the picture. So again, this diagram we are seeing here is an example of a computer. They are now a bit smaller. Now they are not occupying the entire building, but now they are occupying like an entire desk. So you can clearly see that this is an entire desk or size of a computer that was used in the second generation. So the main features of these computers is that they use transistors. They were more reliable than the first generation. They were much smaller in size. They generated less heat as compared to the first generation, and consumed much less electricity than the first generation computers. They were much faster. They costed cheaper. The AC is for cooling, because still a lot of it could be generated, but AC, the system that is used for cooling a house or a room, so it was still requiring an AC to cool it down. And again, the major difference that arose with the second generation of computers is that they used machine and assembly language. Remember, we have said the IC is actually air conditioner or air conditioning. So the examples of computers that were in the second generation, now you can see the names here, and the idea is that you can always Google for these names, and you actually see them, how they look like. The same way you can Google for iPhone X, or you can Google for iPhone 8 or whichever latest iPhone we have. The same way you can look at for these second generation computers, and you can actually see the features. You see the features that were there those days. That was around 1965 or thereabout. That generation was between 1965 and 1971. The computers of that generation used ICs. That is what we have already said. The ICs replaced the transistors, and a single IC has many transistors, many resistors, and many capacitors, along with their associated circuitry. The ICs was invented by someone called Jack Kilby. This development made computers much smaller in size, they much more reliable and efficient. In this generation, remote processing, time sharing, multi-programming operating systems came into the picture. And again, high-level programming languages like Fortran 2 to 4, COBOL, Pascal, BASIC, and Algo 68, among others, were used during this generation. So even today, there are many institutions that still train their students by using Pascal. I'm not sure about BASIC, but I know I have seen those people who have done diploma in ICT that is offered by KNEC. I know they use Pascal for training. This is still a very versatile language that can still be used today, but of course it has been overtaken by events. You know, the new languages that are used today are like, someone was asking me about Python some time back, C#, the new languages we use today, JavaScript. So these are very modern languages. They still fall under the category of high-level languages, but in those days of 1965 to 1971, the language in use was these ones, the likes of COBOL, Pascal, etc. And if you go to any institution of higher learning, you actually see books, very many of them that cover these programming languages, but mostly we do not cover them anymore. The main features of the third generations are ICs, as we have mentioned, that replaced transistors. They are more reliable than second generations. They are much smaller in size. And of course, you can now see the size, how the third generation of computers look like. They were much smaller. Now they could be put on a desk and much smaller. They are not the size of a table or a bench. At least they are much smaller in size. And they produced much less heat. They were much faster, lesser maintenance. Of course, less costly. They still required some fan or AC and consume less electricity and support high-level languages. And now the computers of those days are these ones. If you actually Google this, you'll see these computers, just like we have said. Now we are drawing closer to where we are. Fourth generation computers. The period of fourth generation was from 1971 to 1980. Computers of fourth generation used very large scale integration circuits, and VLSI circuits have about 5,000 transistors and other circuit elements with their associated circuitry on a single chip. So as I mentioned, one chip just that size. If it goes bigger, it goes that size. And you're saying that you can have 5,000 transistors stored here. Fourth generation computers again are more powerful, they are compact, and they are much more affordable. So at this time, this is where we got the rise of personal computers. I know you have seen these types of computers, and these are the ones that came with the word PC or personal computers. The other word that also came in those days was Mac. That is what gave rise to personal computers. So it is actually in the fourth generation that we started having these types of computers. I don't know if you ever have heard, but we used to have something called floppy disk. So in the old days, they used to have the size of 1.44 megabytes. So talk about small memory. And I actually personally I found these computers being in use when I was in high school. We used to have this floppy disk. A small box here was we were putting the floppy disk there, and you save some information there. So in this generation, we got the idea of time sharing, real time networks, distributed operating systems, among others. So all the high level languages like C and C++ were used in this generation. So the main features of the fourth generations are very large scale integration was used. They became much cheaper. It is at this stage that people now could now afford personal computers, and therefore they started being acquired by homes. They were much more portable and reliable. That is where the idea of PCs came. They are much more in size. Pipelining was processing came into the picture. Now they do not require an AC because they have fans already installed in the computers. The concept of internet was introduced, although not much adopted at that stage. And there was development of networking. So networking now came in the picture where you could connect one computer with another computer here. And the computers that belong to the fourth generation are actually these ones.